In 1968, a woman named Miriam Elspeth Callan, a military nurse retired living quietly in Taos, New Mexico, told her neighbor something she kept locked away for 21 years. She didn't write it down. She didn't go to the press. She said it once over coffee in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. She said that in the summer of 1947 she had been in a room with something that was not human, and before they took it away, it had looked at her, and it had smiled. That's where we begin. I want to start with the smile, not the crash, not the recovery operation, not the press releases that came and went like weather. The smile. Because everything else about the Roswell incident has been dissected, debated, dismissed, and occasionally declassified. But this single gesture from something that should not have been capable of gesture, this has been almost entirely ignored. And the deeper I went into Miriam Callan's account, the more I understood why. She was stationed at Roswell Army Air Field in the summer of 1947. Her assignment was routine: administrative nursing, triage support, the ordinary rhythms of a post-war military installation that was, by most accounts, a quiet posting. She had requested the transfer herself. She wanted somewhere without the chaos of a metropolitan base. Somewhere calm. She got the opposite. What happened in the first days of July 1947 has been the subject of more books, more documentaries, more congressional inquiries than almost any other event in modern American history, and we still don't have a definitive answer. What we're told is this: a weather balloon came down on a ranch outside Roswell. The debris was recovered. It was mundane. Case closed. But the official explanation breaks here, and it breaks badly, because Miriam Callan was not summoned to examine balloon debris. She was summoned at approximately 3:40 in the morning on July 6, 1947. Summoned, she would later say, by a superior officer whose name she refused to repeat, and brought to a room she had never been in before, in a section of the base she described as separate from the rest, like it had been built apart on purpose. She was given no briefing. She was told only to stand by, to be available, to keep quiet. She kept quiet for 21 years. What she walked into was a room with bad lighting. That's the first detail she gave her neighbour, Dorothy Schramm, who wrote it down in a personal diary entry, dated November 14, 1968, a diary that her granddaughter Patricia Schramm Holloway of Albuquerque allowed me to review in partial transcript. The diary entry is 6 pages. Most of it is Dorothy's own reactions: shock, disbelief, the sensation of not knowing what to do with what she'd just been told. But the details she records are specific, consistent, the kind of specific that doesn't come from fabrication. Bad lighting, a smell she couldn't place, not chemical, not biological in any way she recognized, but present, persistent. And on a table, covered partially by what she described as a grey-green tarp, something that was not a human being. She didn't say alien, not in Dorothy's account. She said it was a body, but it wasn't right. She said the proportions were off in a way that registered before she could name what was wrong. The head, the hands, the chest, which was narrower than any chest she'd seen in years of nursing. Like the blueprint was the same, Dorothy's diary records her saying, but something had been left out. And here's the strangest part. It was breathing. Not dead. Not a specimen. Not a recovered piece of wreckage, which is the framework every official account has handed us when it's bothered to acknowledge the bodies at all. Breathing. Moving slightly. And according to Miriam Callan, it was aware. This raises a simple but critical question. Why would a military nurse be brought to examine a weather balloon? She wouldn't. And they didn't. What Miriam described in that conversation, and what Dorothy Schramm recorded with what I can only describe as the diligence of someone trying to get something important right, was a medical situation. There were others in the room, 2 men she didn't recognize in clothing that was not standard military uniform, though she couldn't specify what it was. A physician she'd seen on base whose name she knew but didn't share. And this being This thing on the table that was alive and looking at the ceiling, and at some point in the approximately 40 minutes she was present, turned its head and looked directly at her. Let me sit with that for a moment. 40 minutes. In a room on a military base in the summer of 1947, with an extraterrestrial being that was, by her account, conscious and observant. And in those 40 minutes, the only 40 minutes in recorded human history where a credible named witness appears to have been in close proximity to a living non-human intelligence, what was said, what was documented, what was learned, we don't know, because nobody asked. Or if they did, the answers have been removed from the public record with an efficiency that is itself worth examining. Dorothy Schramm's diary didn't surface publicly until 2003, when her granddaughter mentioned it in a letter to a researcher named Carl Hennessy, who was at that time compiling testimonial accounts for a private archive in Santa Fe. Hennessy, to his credit, treated it carefully. He cross-referenced the timeline. He verified that a Miriam E. Callan had indeed been rostered at Roswell Army Air Field in 1947, appearing in 2 surviving administrative records, a supply requisition log from April of that year, and a personnel transfer document dated September 1947, moving her to a base in Georgia with no stated reason for reassignment. 2 documents from a nurse who was on base during the most scrutinized incident in the history of American airspace. 2. And here's where the pattern begins to take shape, because when you start looking at other named personnel from Roswell in that window, the first 2 weeks of July 1947, you find the same thing over and over. Sparse records, transfers without stated causes, gaps where files should be continuous but aren't. Hennessy documented 14 such cases in his 2004 archive report, which was self-published in a limited run of 200 copies, and is, as of this writing, almost entirely unavailable. I obtained a photocopy of 31 pages through a researcher in Denver who wishes to remain unnamed. The pattern he describes is not random. It is, in fact, suspiciously uniform. 14 personnel, 14 records with the same anomalies. Not 12, not 20, not a mixed bag of administrative inconsistencies. 14 clustered in the same 2-week window, showing the same kinds of gaps, the same unexplained transfers, the same silence where documentation should be loudest. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. And once you see it, you genuinely cannot unsee it. Now, the smile. I've spent considerable time with this detail because it's the one most easily dismissed. A smile from a non-human being is the kind of claim that invites ridicule before examination, which may be precisely why it survived, because no one thought it was worth debunking. But Miriam apparently described it to Dorothy not as a human smile, not as an expression of warmth or recognition in any way she could map onto her experience. She said it was a small movement, asymmetrical. One side of a face that didn't have the musculature to smile the way we understand smiling, and yet something moved, something shifted. And she felt, she said, that it was intentional, that it was directed at her specifically, not at the doctors, not at the men in unfamiliar clothing. At her. Why her? That question has stayed with me longer than any other. Was she the only one in the room who appeared frightened? Was she the youngest? Was she the only woman? Or, and I recognize this steps onto uncertain ground, was there something about her specifically that this being registered as different, significant, worth acknowledging? I don't know. I can't know. But I noticed that Miriam, according to Dorothy, never framed it as threatening. She never described fear in that specific moment. She described something closer to recognition, as though something looked at her and saw her clearly, more clearly than the circumstance should have allowed, and offered her something, some small strange gesture, in return. That is not how you describe a weather balloon. There's a woman named Agnes Purdy who comes into this story sideways the way most corroborating accounts do. Agnes was a civilian laundress who worked on the base in 1947, and she gave an interview in 1979 to a regional New Mexico radio program, KOTS, out of Deming, that was recorded but, as far as anyone can determine, never broadcast. A tape of the interview exists, or existed. A transcript was made by the program's producer, a man named William Billy Torrance, who kept his personal files in storage in Las Cruces until his death in 1991. What happened to those files after his death is unclear. His family recalls a storage unit. The storage unit, according to his son Gerald, was cleared by a company that couldn't be traced. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm reporting what I found, which is a record that someone made a record, and then the record disappeared. The shape of an absence. What Agnes apparently said, and I'm working here from a handwritten summary Torrance made in a personal notebook that did survive, which Gerald Torrance shared with me during a phone interview in the spring of this year, was that she had seen something brought into the medical wing of the base in the early hours of July 6th, 1947. She described it as small. She described it as being carried, not on a stretcher, but held, supported by two men who appeared to be handling it with considerable care. She said it was making a sound, not a voice, not words, a sound she described as like static that meant something. Static that meant something. Agnes Purdy never gave another interview. She moved to Tucson sometime in the early 1980s. I've been unable to locate any living relatives. Let me ask you something. If you were a military nurse in 1947 and you spent 40 minutes in a room with a living extraterrestrial being, what would you do with that information? Where would it go inside you? How would it reorganize everything you understood about the nature of reality, about the singularity of human life, about the meaning of intelligence in the universe? Miriam Callan sat on it for 21 years. 21 years of ordinary life. We know she married in 1951, had 2 children, worked in a civilian hospital outside Albuquerque through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, eventually settled in Taos. 21 years of grocery shopping and school plays and the daily mechanics of an ordinary existence, with this thing living inside her, this knowledge. And then one morning she told Dorothy, just Dorothy, just once. The deeper you go into why people choose that particular moment, why they hold something decades and then release it not to journalists or investigators, but to a neighbour over coffee, the more you start to understand that the release isn't really about the information, it's about the weight. Miriam didn't tell Dorothy because she wanted the world to know. She told Dorothy because she needed to say it out loud to another human being before she died. She needed it to exist outside of herself. She passed away in March 1971. Dorothy outlived her by 12 years. I want to return to the room because the room is where everything either stands or collapses. Miriam described, through Dorothy, an environment that was not a standard military medical facility. The table was not a gurney. The lighting came from a single source she couldn't identify. Not a fixture she recognized. There was equipment she couldn't name. And the men in non-uniform clothing were doing something with that equipment that she couldn't follow. Taking readings, maybe, or documenting, or communicating. She didn't know. What she did know was nursing. She knew bodies. She knew what distress looked like in a living organism. And she knew the particular alertness, the particular quality of attention that a conscious being has versus an unconscious one. And she was certain, she told Dorothy, that this being was conscious, that it was tracking the room, that it knew, in some functional sense, where it was. Can you imagine being it? Can you sit with that for a moment, the position of that being? Whatever it came from, however far, whatever the nature of its interior life, it was in an unfamiliar room, on an unfamiliar table, in an unfamiliar world, surrounded by creatures it had perhaps never seen up close, who were studying it with instruments it recognized or didn't, and it could not leave. It was too hurt to leave. And it lay there processing this, and at some point it turned its head and found one face in the room that perhaps registered as different to it, a little afraid, a little open, looking without the clinical detachment of the others, and something happened in the lower half of that grey face, something that Miriam Callan understood, across every difference of biology and origin and world, as acknowledgement. Here's what I keep returning to. The specific nature of that gesture suggests something much larger than a physical encounter, because a smile, even an approximation of a smile, even a movement that only resembles one, is a social behaviour. It's a behaviour that exists because it communicates something about interior state. It's a behaviour that evolved, presumably, because the beings that used it got something back, which means this was not instinct, this was not reflex, this was intentional communication, from something to someone, across a distance that should have made communication impossible, and then they took it away. That phrase, Miriam's phrase, as Dorothy recorded it, is the one I find most difficult to move past. They took it away. After approximately 40 minutes, something changed in the room. The men with the equipment became purposeful. The physician stepped back, and the being on the table was relocated. She didn't see to where. She was escorted out before that happened, but she heard something as she left. She told Dorothy she heard from behind the closed door the sound she could only describe as a long tone that stopped. A long tone. That stopped. She never heard it again. Nobody in any surviving account mentions a tone. It appears nowhere in any document, official or otherwise, that I've been able to find. It exists only in 6 pages of a personal diary, written by a woman reporting what her neighbour told her over coffee in November 1968. And it is either the least verifiable detail in this entire account, or the most important one. I haven't decided yet. The official history of Roswell is tidy. Balloon, debris, misidentification, case closed. What the evidence suggests is something considerably messier, not in a conspiratorial way, not in a way that requires us to posit dark intent, but in the way that genuine encounters with the unknown are always messy. They don't resolve, they accumulate, they leave traces in the wrong places, in a nurse's kept silence, in a neighbour's diary, in a radio interview that was never broadcast, in a storage unit that was cleared by a company that couldn't be traced. Not chaos, not coincidence. Pattern, and the pattern, followed to its endpoint, opens into a question that I think is the real centre of this story. Not who was in the room, not what the equipment was doing, not even what the being was or where it came from. The real question is what happened in those 40 minutes that was never recorded. Because here's what the record shows. There are notes missing. Not just from Miriam Callan's file, from the entire medical wing of Roswell Army Air Field for the period July 5th through July 9th, 1947. Those records existed at some point. We know this because the facility inspector's log from August of that year references them in a routine compliance inventory. By 1953, when a researcher first formally requested access to Roswell medical documentation under early precursors to what would become the Freedom of Information Act, the response came back, records unavailable. Not classified, not restricted, unavailable. There's a difference, and that difference matters. What might 40 minutes with a living extraterrestrial intelligence have contained? What might have been said, communicated, gestured, transmitted in whatever form their communication took? What was the long tone that stopped? Was it directed at the others in the room? Was it an attempt at language? Was it, and I ask this with full awareness of how it sounds, was it asking something? The deeper you go into what was potentially lost in that room, the more the scale of it becomes difficult to hold. We talk about first contact as a future event, a horizon, something that may happen, that we should prepare for, that raises philosophical and scientific and diplomatic questions we're not yet equipped to answer. But Miriam Callan's account, fragmentary, second-hand, preserved only by the diligence of a neighbour with a diary, suggests that contact may have already happened, that it happened in a room with bad lighting in the summer of 1947, that it lasted 40 minutes, and it ended with a tone and a smile and silence. I've gone back to Dorothy Schramm's diary entry more times than I can count. 6 pages, written in a careful hand, in November of 1968. The last paragraph is the one I come back to most. Dorothy writes that after Miriam finished telling her everything, after the coffee went cold and the morning went on, and they sat there in whatever that silence between two ordinary women holding an extraordinary thing feels like, Miriam said one more thing, not about the being, not about the room, about herself. She said, "I think about whether it got back. That's all I ever really think about. Not what it was. Not what it meant for humanity. Not the philosophical implications of consciousness existing elsewhere in the universe. Just, did it get back? It is the most human response to an inhuman encounter I've ever encountered. And I've been at this long enough to know that the human responses are often where the truth lives. Did it get back? Where is back for something like that? Is there a place, somewhere at a distance we can't conceive of, where a being arrived home having seen something it wasn't supposed to see, our skies, our faces, our fear, our curiosity, and was asked what we were like? And did it find, in whatever passes for language there, a way to describe the woman at the table's edge who looked at it without clinical detachment and received something back? And if it did, if there is a place where that account exists, what does it say about us? What was in those missing records? What happened after the 40 minutes ended? What did the physician write down before the writing was taken away? What did the 2 men in non-uniform clothing do with their equipment, and where did that data go? And who has seen it since? Who decided what would be remembered? What else has been left to live only in someone's silence, waiting for a Tuesday morning and a neighbour and a cup of cold coffee to let it out? Is Miriam Callan's account the exception? Or is it just the one that was written down, and somewhere, in a file that is not unavailable but simply unasked for, in a storage unit no one has thought to trace, in the memory of someone very old who is waiting for the right morning to speak? What else is there?